for every 100 murders that happens in Lexington, I'd say the homicide unit knows who did it 95% of the time.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, Cold Case Investigations with Detective Rob Wilson, Part 1 of 2. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. I'm David. In the next 2 episodes, we're going to take the listeners through a journey and an educational trip on learning about cold case investigations. To do this, we have asked Detective Rob Wilson to return to the Murder Police Podcast. Listeners will remember him from other cases that we've covered. Detective Wilson just retired before we recorded this from the Lexington Police Department and was the last cold case investigator when he left. 3 top things to listen for in this podcast. 1 is Detective Wilson is going to talk about what a cold case is, how they become cold, how they are selected for investigation, and the challenges in those. Additionally, we had asked listeners before that if they could ask a cold case investigator one question about the missing case of Melanie Flynn in Lexington, Kentucky, what would that question be? And Detective Wilson is going to answer those listener questions. And finally, we're going to talk about Gabby Petito without really talking about Gabby. This tragic case of the young woman that was found murdered has been covered very well across the country in virtually every news outlet and by many other true crime podcasts. What we're going to talk about in this case, though, is the amateur detectives, because this case of Gabby Petito really brought that to the forefront of a lot of people's attention. Detective Wilson is going to talk about how he feels about getting assistance from people in the community and offer advice for people who do have their heart in the right place and are trying to make a difference. With that, let's get to the interview with Detective Rob Wilson and talk about cold case investigations.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. Today, we are talking with Detective Rob Wilson. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me again.
David, how are you over there?
Doing good. This is going to be a super show for everybody that's interested in homicide investigations.
Well, for those listeners who have not heard Rob on our show before, he's done 2 shows previously, which I highly encourage you to listen to. But Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history?
Well, basically been in Lexington my entire life. Went to Lafayette High School, then University of Kentucky, then got on to the police department around 1998. Did 3 years in patrol. The next 20 years were in the homicide unit. And I just retired last Friday.
Well, congratulations on that retirement.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome to the 15th of the month club.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I got bored the other day. I was stuck in the parking garage. I was like, how many hours is 23 years? And I gave roughly 5 hours of overtime generously, I think, for each week. Came out to close to 75,000 hours that I've worked as a police officer. And that was mind-boggling.
Oh, that is. I never thought of it in that aspect, but that's pretty spooky, actually.
Well, I mean, we do have some that stayed on. I won't mention any names, but, look, guys, there's some that have been there for 37 years. You could have done it, Rob.
Not a chance.
Yeah, it's not a marathon or a contest. It really isn't, trust me.
Well, Rob, do you feel comfortable talking about what your next venture is?
Yeah, I'm just going to take some time right now and look into maybe doing some contract work for investigations.
Very nice.
Well, tell us a little bit about that career. And that was a quick exit from patrol into investigations. I know back at the police department by contract, you have to have 3 years, but back then we didn't have a contract. So getting in that early was definitely a hat tip to who you are, because they don't ask you in early if they don't think you're going to work out. But take us through what that looked like on the evolution of becoming a homicide detective and how you developed in that.
Well, as soon as I decided I wanted to make law enforcement my career, being a homicide detective was the end goal. That's what I wanted. And I figured I just assumed everybody wanted to be a homicide detective. And so once I looked into it, I knew I had to do 3 years on patrol. Wasn't really happy about that, but I knew I had to do it. And come to find out, I really enjoyed it. And to be a homicide detective, you have to be a patrol officer, and an active one, and then, one that's engaged in your sector, your beat. That's where I learned how to talk to people. That's where I got my confidential informants. So it was essential that 3 years in there, I gained so much knowledge that I didn't even really know I was learning at the time. Just interacting with different people, different races, different genders, different neighborhoods, different socioeconomic variations. But the 3 years came up, and an opening came up in robbery homicide. I didn't think I'd get it. I was still pretty young or whatever, and I don't remember how many people I interviewed against, but went through the process, and I got the call from John Dixon, I believe was the lieutenant over homicide at the time. He called me up and said I got the spot, so I was super excited, and then I got really scared.
Yeah, because you're there. And by the way, John Dixon was probably one of my favorite bosses in my career. So a big shout out to John. He was an amazing guy to work for.
Yeah.
Well, let me take it back a little bit. You said that from the time you decided to be the police, answer two things. Why did you want to get into policing? And even more so, what interested you in death investigation? Because I think the listeners, for the most part in our audience, have that interest in this, wrapping their minds around that. Can you detail that? Because I'll bet that they have the same interest in some aspects.
I never really thought about it, but I think if you break it down, it's the little boy in me that wanted to play cops and robbers. And then when I decided that was going to be my profession, if I'm going to go catch bad guys, I want to go after the worst of the worst. I want to get the monsters. And so that was just kind of my drive all along. And yeah, I'm really glad I did it because it was an extremely rewarding career.
Did you use the word you got scared when you got in?
Yeah, it was, I have a lot of reverence for that position. And once you go into homicide, it is a steep learning curve. You make one mistake and maybe a killer gets away. It's not like, I'm not downplaying any other unit, but if you're in another unit that's dealing with property or something like that, then if you make a mistake, then maybe somebody just doesn't get their lawnmower back. So these, you're dealing with, and we had sex crimes at the time. So if you make a mistake, collect a piece of evidence that you shouldn't have simply by a mistake because you're new, and that becomes inadmissible, but that was part of your probable cause to charge. 8 months later, you lose that at a suppression hearing, then they may have to drop the charges altogether. So I asked a lot of questions. The people in the unit at that time were fantastic. They had a lot of experience. James Curlis, Paul Williams, Chris Schoonover. They were great. They really took me under their wing, and I learned from the best.
Absolutely. And talking about learning, and I think I know the answer, but you'll agree. Do you have a lot of spin-up time when you get up there, or are you pretty much thrown into the fire?
Thrown into the fire.
Amen. And a lot of people I don't think they appreciate that sometimes, that I know that most people, it's just you're up there for a matter of days and you land your first one.
Yeah, it was, I remember one of my, it's a murder trial, and I'd probably been on 6-7 years in the unit at that point. The defense attorney was crossing me over an interview technique I'd used in an interview of a suspect. I was like, we've obviously had so much training in this. And I had to start, I was like, ma'am, I've had no training. It's all on the job training. She assumed I went to schools and learned about how to interview and interrogate people, and that simply wasn't the fact. You learned as you went, and that's why I refer back to those years on patrol were so valuable.
And that's a good point, too, for people that might be interested in moving into death investigations that are on the road now. If you were to talk to one of those people and you knew that was their goal, how would you sum up some advice to a patrol officer about how to achieve that goal? What do you need? What do they need to do right now?
First of all, they got to care. You may not be doing the job you want right now, but do that job to the best that you can, and that'll only reflect on you because, as you know, detectives, when they receive reports, they read those reports. And if you do a half-ass job, well, then you're known as a half-ass officer. So when you're out there taking a report, you need to treat it like it's extremely important because of who's going to read it. And also, we get called and say, hey, we all do this interview, and we're like, we're certainly glad to help, but why don't you want to? Well, we don't really do these interviews. And Matt Brotherton and I always used to tell him, it's like, you do more interviews in a day than we do a week. consider every call you go on an interview. You're interviewing the victim. You're interviewing the neighbor. There may be a suspect. Go ahead and talk to them as well. So just treat those opportunities as learning opportunities.
Yeah, grab it while you got a chance. And you make a good point, but I think what stops a lot of people is that you said, too, that position has an elevated status inside police departments. Sometimes I think it's incorrect the way people look at it. Like a lot of people think it's a prideful position or a glory position. And I've always said that very few things will deliver humility to somebody like that will. I think the only other way you could get humility harder would be to play Fortnite and let an 8-year-old beat you.
Right.
Don't be knocking on your stepson, Jeff.
No,
Jasper
exactly.
Here, come on.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, seriously, is that I think that the perception from the outside, because of movies and TV, is that it looks like some big dream job. And Dr. Greg Davis, we interviewed him a while back, and he referred to that same thing in medicine as people think that they have a perception of it that's not real. So that's important things for people to know, especially if they're out on the road, is to develop those skills early.
Yeah, and people will come up and ask me, and it's like, well, is it just like the movies or just like TV? I'm like, maybe 2 minutes of it. I go, the rest of it is you're documenting what you did. You're putting your case file together. You're talking with the attorneys, the prosecutor. You're talking with your supervisors. You're getting to-do lists ready to go, what you need to get done after the arrest. Yeah, they don't show that in the movies because it's not sexy.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there's a lot of work behind the scenes that needs to get done after you put the handcuffs on.
Huge. For example, the days of when you had to proofread an interview transcript, and the interview was 4 hours long.
Yes.
And, we had fantastic staff assistants in Bureau of Investigation at the Lexington Police Department. You get to be good friends with all of them.
Absolutely.
And the thing is that you still have to read that work because they're trying to understand what we're saying in that interview. But I remember hours with an ink pen going through that, and because it still has to be accurate. And you're right, people from the outside don't see that.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. That staff, Brenda Estes, who just passed, Sandy Jordan, who's up there right now, we couldn't do it without them.
Exactly. I stay in touch with Linda Cummins. I mean, and a bunch of them, and their names are going to fail me, and I'm going to feel really bad about that here in a minute. But that's another thing too. When I think people from the outside that are curious about this world, I don't know if they realize how much those people in those positions know about everything you and I did.
Right.
They knew more than the supervisors did.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah, because everything that went into the dictation tank and all of that kind of stuff, it was amazing. The ability for them to pack that knowledge around. And, of course, they kept the secret like everybody else did. They were amazing people for that.
Another thing that always interested me about the fact-burst fictions, I love crime novels, fiction novels, the Prey series, the Harry Bosch novels. And there's like, how real are those? I was like, a lot of them are fairly accurate until the end where the bad guy pulls a gun on the cop and the cop gets to kill him and it never goes to trial. It's like, who did it. But at that point of the time of the shootout, do you have enough to charge him? A lot of times you don't. So it just, it wraps it up with a nice little bow. But in reality, that hardly ever happens. And you got to put the cuffs on and really defend your case in court.
Exactly. Dot those I's and cross the T's for sure. So when you get up there and you're baptized in the fire, you're learning as you go. And I'm going to agree with you that group of people you listed would probably be the A team as far as developing people. I have no doubt because I got to work with all of them too. Mm-hmm. How did that progress? For example, do you remember the first case you got?
Well, I started out, I think as well they should have, I got assigned to robbery. And I was like a second on a couple of murders with Chris Schoonover, Megan Liebengood. We did that. I was his number 2 on that. I think that was 2004, and I got up there in 2002. But yeah, my first case as a lead investigator in a homicide was Kelly Gray. We got called over to Venetian Road over near Center Parkway. Female white with a gunshot wound to the head. It appeared to be suicide. Something just didn't look right. The angle, like the entrance wound was closer to the back of her head as opposed to the side. As you well know, it's like there's never any perfect suicide scene. There's always a question that a family member will be like, it's not suicide, it's murder. And you just have to work through that. And we pulled the 2 sons down to headquarters to do formal interviews to them, see who was the last time to talk to mom. And just through the course of the investigation, their stories weren't adding up. And we finally focused in on Kelly, who was the last one to see her. And Kelly had some mental issues. And we finally got him to confess that he had gone through a moment and believed he was saving his mom's soul and wound up shooting her in the back of the head with a .357. So that was my first one. That was a good one to learn on. I leaned a lot on Chris that entire night. He was walking me through it and telling me, I think you need to interview this guy next because he's the next step. So, I never quit learning from Chris. And up until my last year, I was still asking advice. You can never learn too much about an investigation.
For sure. And what a case to get to, because it sounds like you got handled a genuine mental health issue.
It was. I think he got the appropriate sentence. He was sent to a mental institution for, I think, probably close to a decade until, the doctors viewed that he wasn't a danger to society anymore.
Yeah. People don't understand that. Maybe we'll do a show on that one time, because you have people that, I don't think they understand how hard that is to feign that, and how the system has a lot of evaluations in place to catch that. But when you get one of those, that's a different challenge. It
is. You got a couple extra hurdles to get over. The Brenda Cowan murder. A lot of people, Matt Brothers and I, he was the lead on it. We tried to interview the suspect, and people came out, he's just pretending to be crazy. And we're like, no, he's mentally ill. He truly was. This wasn't somebody trying to get away with anything. He was having people speak to him in his head. And, it's, I can't say I've never been fooled, but you recognize fairly early on when someone has a true mental illness. It's darn near unfakeable.
Right. And Brenda Cowan, by the way, was a Lexington firefighter that was killed in the line of duty by that suspect. And you're right. It stands out. It stands out because I had them feign. I had a guy arrested and charged with murder one time, and I guess he thought after he gave me his statement that he should throw the mental thing in, and he started looking at the doorway like he was talking to his stepson. And I was like, okay, y'all have this conversation. I'm going to go finish your paperwork. And that one you could see a mile away. Well, how did you, during this career, and 20 years is a long time in that unit, tell us about how you migrated or got into the cold case investigation and how that was.
Well, the first cold case unit got started up, was it 10, 12 years ago, roughly? Chris Schoonover, we got a federal grant to create a cold case. And at that point, Chris was without a doubt, the obvious choice to be the investigator in that. James Curlis was still the lieutenant and Paul Williams was the sergeant. And Chris did great work. He's so dedicated and so meticulous. I really admired him for him. I'd just sit there and watch him read in his office for 8 hours a day sometimes, just going over old case files, taking notes, getting to-do lists. And so I'm lucky I got to watch him do that for when my time came around. Chris did a lot of good work. I believe he closed 1 or 2 old murders. And then finally the funding had dried up. And, we're always worried about staffing positions in the police department. I believe it became considered a non-essential position. And so they ended that, and Chris continued on for a little bit longer and then soon after retired. And then a couple of years go by, and Commander Albert Johnson, I believe in January of 2019, recommended to Chief Weathers that we reopen it. Chief Weathers gave his blessing, and Commander Johnson asked me if I'd run the unit and was happy to do so.
That's interesting stuff, and the idea that, again, people in the community don't understand is that everything inside of a police department is based on budgets. And I've always said that they are a business. They usually take up most of the operating capital in a local government.
Yes.
And as much as we would like to believe that the police departments and the state police and the FBI are just like on TV where people are tirelessly pounding away, and they are, there's a limit. And especially when budgets get tight. And unfortunately, things like cold case do become kind of like luxuries.
Yeah, it's fringe. And you can say all you want, but the backbone of any police department is the Bureau of Patrol.
Amen.
You have to have those guys on the street answering 911 emergency calls. So that's what you have to take care of as a chief of police. You have to make sure the Bureau of Patrol is taken care of. Anything after that, then I think the clear unit is fantastic, the neighborhood officers, but it's the people that are frontliners in the community. Those are the essential personnel. Then I think the investigators come in, and then a cold case, because I think it's very needed, but it's not necessary, if that makes any sense. But certain spots have to be filled before you get luxury positions.
Let me ask you this. How does a case get cold, and what does that mean?
Well, in our unit, we don't really have any hard lines of when it's cold. You could work a case for 8 months and it still be hot. As long as you're doing stuff or there's stuff to be done, that primary investigator will stay with it. And even when it does go cold, as long as that detective is still in the unit, that case stays with him. Like, I never solved my very first murder. It happened in 2002. Well, that was my second one. It stayed with me, even though I wound up going to cold case. But it would have stayed with me as long as I stayed in the unit. So the only time it really gets defined cold as coming to the cold case unit is it remains unsolved and the lead detective retires, transfers out, or something like that. Then that case file would move to the cold case unit.
Well, some people would ask, and again, maybe it's not unreasonable, why do they even get cold at all? What are the things that get in the way of working a case? Even if a case is hot, are there things that as much as we may not care for them, they get in the way?
The biggest thing that will slow down an investigation by far is lack of community cooperation. For every 100 murders that happens in Lexington, I'd say the homicide unit knows who did it 90-95% of the time. But when you don't have the community assisting, when they have knowledge and refuse to share it, the DNA is great and ballistics are great, but nothing beats witnesses cooperating with the police department to secure an arrest and a conviction.
And it's fundamental to our system of justice.
Absolutely.
Is that I've ranted a little bit, and I won't rant a lot today about how it's actually part of your social contract, that if you want to live in a civilized society, you have to dip in. And it's frustrating because I know we hear a lot of times, well, people are afraid to come forward. And it was my experience, and I don't think this has changed, that exists, but it is not the entire piece of the pie if you break it down. Because there are people that just don't because they won't.
Correct.
I can remember one time interviewing a witness that after we'd identified a suspect, and she actually watched a guy get stabbed to death with a screwdriver and get rolled up in a carpet and drug out of the apartment. And once I took her statement, I actually just asked her politely, I said, is there any reason why you didn't bring this forward before? Just wanted to know. And her exact response was, because it was none of my damn business. And I'm like, okay, that's not fair or anything, but I think that's a problem that we need to have addressed, because I'm pretty sure it's killing the unit right now.
Yeah, I've actually had a murder individual was shot in a drive-by, and his sister was standing right there and knew the shooter. And I get the information. I was like, oh, this is going to be a quick one to solve. She refused to cooperate. And I was like, why wouldn't you help me catch the person that killed your brother? And she said, I ain't no snitch. And I didn't know what to say at that point.
It becomes its own cultural phenomenon. Like it's unreal. Like it starts to defeat itself. And again, there's no rhyme or reason to that except because.
Yeah. And when people bark at us for not being able to solve a murder, you just want to point to that.
Yeah, because I remember when I was in the unit, and then I had that short stint of when part of the units that I supervised was that unit, was how many times people in a family would call and yell at a detective, and not always yelling demented, more out of frustration, and say things like, everybody knows who did this.
Yes.
And they were probably right.
Yes.
But the only response you had was, everybody but us knows
Yes.
who did that. So that's a frustrating thing.
Yeah, and you get to the point where it's like, ma'am, I'm sorry we haven't made an arrest in this case, but would you please go talk to your nephew? Because he has the information that will give me probable cause to make an arrest. I've talked to him 3 times. He refuses to speak with me. If you have any influence over him, I recommend you speak with him and have him come down to headquarters, because he's holding the key to the gate.
Right. There are so many binders up in that unit and all over the country that have names of people that are high likelihood. And again, they have connect the dot people all the way up to that name.
Yes.
And that's a sign of a very good investigation. The only failure is on the community side at that point,
Yeah.
to at least meet halfway and say, okay, I can make that connection between these 2 dots.
And there are certain situations where I kind of understand their predicament. I don't live in that neighborhood, but not all of it is fear of retaliation. It's just, I refuse to cooperate with the police department. So it's in a situation where, okay, I live down the street from the suspect. If he sees you all knocking on my door and you all come in for an hour, then I'm going to have problems. And I get that, but that's not the case all the time.
Exactly. And I think that's my thing with it that I'm trying to get across is that we can't paint that with a wide brush like
Correct.
that. That's very misleading. And again, kind of like with mental health, is even though you're not a mental health professional, when you start meeting people, you start to get an idea that this is probably going to be the case. And
Yes.
the same thing when you're talking to witnesses and things like that, you pretty quick put together whether it's a valid concern, because we have had people, but again, it's not the biggest bulk. There's been shootings where there literally are scores of people standing there. I mean, literally scores. And they're watching what happened. And when the police get there, nobody saw a thing. And that's the cultural deficit in that too. Not even the anonymous tip, because
Right.
we want you want the witness statement, but holy cow, just the tip that launch it would be great.
Yes.
Well, good stuff. Now, when a case winds up in that status where it hasn't moved for a while, and you're a cold case investigator, where a department has the luxury at any given time to have a cold case investigator or more, is there training available for cold case investigators?
There is. There's not much. The department sent me to one in Washington, D.C. this past May. It was very beneficial. So there is training out there. There were federal agencies, state police, local detectives, prosecutors, medical examiners. There was about 200 people there. It was very informative.
Yeah, that sounds good. Because I guess the reason I wanted to back into that is that how do we decide which ones get looked at? And that probably means a lot to victims' families.
For sure. Well, I thought I had a brilliant idea of how to approach that, but I never got a chance. We hit the ground running. What I wanted to do was, and Lexington's a fortunate size city for a cold case investigator. There's probably, I think, 60, 65 cases assigned to the cold case unit that are unsolved murders. We also have a couple of missing person cases that we believe to be homicide. But when Albert Johnson asked me to take over the unit, my idea was to take a month off. Just sit at my desk. I'm not answering my phone. I'm not doing anything. I want to go through every single case file and separate them into categories. I believe these to be potential DNA cases and set those 12 to the side. This has legs as far as, I think with a couple of new interviews, maybe we can break through what the original detectives said and already pushed close to the line. So set those aside and then maybe read the ones that are too old. Pieces of the case file have gone missing and the probability of solving them is really low. So I don't want to waste too much time with those. I'm not going to forget about them. But let's go to, say, the low-hanging fruit first with the DNA. Go through all of those, submit a bunch of lab requests, and send them off to KSP lab. Hopefully something comes back. And while I'm waiting on those, I'm selecting case files that is going to be old-fashioned detective work, knocking on doors and re-interviewing people, finding new people to interview. So that was my plan, but it was funny. When Albert asked me to take it over, he's like, would you want to do this? It's like, well, on one condition, don't make me work the Melanie Flynn case. I was like, and not out of any disregard for Miss Flynn or her family. I know good investigators have gone through that case with a fine-tooth comb, and really good investigators. And it's like, if they didn't find anything, I'm not going to. And I saw Chris work very hard on that case. In fact, it was kind of pressured from the higher-ups to get some resolution for that case. So he spent, a year more running. He went to Tennessee, New York, interviewing people. So he put in a lot of good work. And me having so much reverence for Chris, he spent a year and a half on that. There's not one thing I could come up with in that case file that Chris Schoonover hadn't already thought of. So I was like, Albert, I think we'd be doing a disservice to all these other cases that I think have potential. And he's like, I agree. It's like, it's your unit. You handle the cases like you want. I bet I started that job, and day 5, I get a call about the Melanie Flynn case. And you get that feeling when you're talking to somebody on the phone. It's like, it kind of rings true. Guy, I'm going to need to go talk to this guy. Before you know it, I was sucked right in. And we spent a solid 6 months. I traveled out to California, some federal prisons, talked to some individuals out there, and just kind of dove back into it. And, it was really interesting. We're not done. There's still some things that I need to do. I keep in touch somewhat with the brothers of Melanie, Brad and Doug. I told him, it's like, I'm not promising anything, but I'm going to promise you that I'm going to look into it and I'm going to try and I'm going to exhaust, everything we can. So that's still not done, but it was kind of funny. It's like, we hadn't had a tip on that case in years. And, 5 days after I say, I'll do this, but I want to work on these other cases that I got sucked in. And we spent months down at the Kentucky River with backhoes and, ground penetrating radar. And so I could see how Chris got sucked into it.
And again, you made a good point. It's nothing against the victim or the family, but you have to triage cases. And I'm going to go along with you. I've never heard it put that way, but it was fine-tooth comb over the years. It's never sat. I think that in the public, some people think it's sat and
Correct.
Alive and well. I've looked at it. I mean, most of us, when I was commanding that unit,
Sure.
and even when I was back in, all of us have taken a look at it, and a lot of eyes. And that's not saying somebody could miss it, but they do get to a point. Most cases will get to the point that absent something truly new coming in, that they stagnate, that there's the cold case element. On that case, for sure, I think that it's important for people to hear that as sporadic as they are, as information does come in on that. For the people who've never heard, because we're making assumptions here, tell us about that, what we're talking about. When you say Melanie Flynn, people locally will probably have an idea what that is, but what's the overall, when we say Melanie Flynn, what's that mean to the audience across the country?
Well, it got its fame with a local book called The Bluegrass Conspiracy, and it centered around corrupt Lexington police detectives. And we're certainly not going to cover anything up. They were very corrupt. They were criminals wearing badges, but they were involved in drug activity to the cartel level, loose associations. There was a murder of a federal judge, I believe, prosecutors, really scary stuff. But in that, there's Melanie Flynn was dating or had a relationship with a detective with the Lexington Police Department, Bill Cowan. That relationship went sour, and shortly after that, Miss Flynn went missing. And the book talks about all the other stuff, the drug smuggling, but it also brings along Melanie Flynn's cases. More than likely the Lexington Police Department had something to do with her demise. And certainly a theory. There are a couple of other theories, but that's what, we've been looking at. Chris spent a lot of time looking at alternative theories because everybody had kind of exhausted the avenue to the Lexington Police Department. So yeah, it was there was just so much work that went into that case, and the case file's incredibly large. Just to read it would take 5 to 6 days.
And what time frame are we talking? When did Melanie go missing?
Late 70s.
So it's been some time.
Yeah, it's and I mentioned Doug and Brad Flynn. They've had a rough go. And again, the relationship with the Lexington Police Department wasn't always great with them, and I've apologized to them. But it's a new day and age, and I promised them and I'd do my best, and really thought we were onto something down at the river. And it still may be accurate. Just because we didn't find anything doesn't mean that it's not accurate. And, when I mentioned I flew out to a federal prison in California, went to interview an inmate who was a former detective with the Lexington Police Department, and he provided the information. It was hearsay information. It wasn't, a smoking gun, so to speak. He's like, this is what I'd heard. And so that's kind of what led us to the river. And that's not the first time that location on the river has been brought up.
Well, wait, I have to ask something. I didn't realize that the person who was the inmate in California was a former detective.
He was.
Was he there because of this corruption, or was...
No, he ran with the people that, it's no secret, Drew Thornton and Bill Cowan were the main people in the Bluegrass Conspiracy. He was a detective along with them. He was arrested by DEA in, I believe, the early 80s for drug running. And then a couple more charges, and he was 3 strikes, you're out. So he's spending life in prison out of the federal pen in California.
And that would have a sense of credence to it, just because of the association. So I could see where you would go with that.
Yeah, and again, we talked to, I believe, Chris and Mike Malone, who was with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, spoke to Bill Cowan in prison. They came away convinced that he didn't have any knowledge, because if he did, he could parlay that into a pardon. And, he even says, like, boys, if I knew where she was, I could blame it on my dead friend, Drew Thornton, and y'all'd let me out of this prison, wouldn't you? And I was like, well, yeah. He's like, if I knew, I'd tell you, because I don't like it in here. So, I think that holds a lot of credence to him saying he doesn't know what happened to her, because he really could. He could have got his sentence cut much shorter than it was.
Gotcha. Well, I'll tell you what. I posed the question to some of our listeners on social media several weeks ago, knowing that we were going to sit down with you, and asked, does anybody have any questions about the Melanie Flynn case? And granted, it's still an open, active investigation, and I know it frustrates people, but there's legitimate reasons why these things aren't shared, and we could do a whole nother show on that. And I know right now I'm thinking of times when information leaks really hurt case investigations.
Absolutely.
So we know that, but I think some of the questions I saw that came through were actually pretty intuitive and pretty insightful. So what we'll do is I'll have Wendy read those to you, and we'll take it from there. And just to kind of help our listeners out, maybe to answer, because this is an opportunity people don't get, is to speak to somebody that's been that close to it.
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about the presenters, and much, much more. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed captions for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast from. Make sure to subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.
And when do you quit? Could you be 5 feet away? Could you be 2 feet away and you quit? It was so hard to give up, because you're thinking, it's like, well, that kind of matches with what he was saying.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Cold Case Investigations with Detective Rob Wilson, Part 2 of 2. Brought to you by Hero Industries, designing and manufacturing uniquely branded products for first responders, government agencies, and corporations.
Gotcha. Well, I'll tell you what. I posed the question to some of our listeners on social media several weeks ago, knowing that we were going to sit down with you, and asked, does anybody have any questions about the Melanie Flynn case? And granted, it's still an open, active investigation, and I know it frustrates people, but there's legitimate reasons why these things aren't shared, and we could do a whole nother show on that. And I know right now I'm thinking of times when information leaks really hurt case investigations.
Absolutely.
So we know that, but I think some of the questions I saw that came through were actually pretty intuitive and pretty insightful. So what we'll do is I'll have Wendy read those to you, and we'll take it from there. And just to kind of help our listeners out, maybe to answer, because this is an opportunity people don't get, is to speak to somebody that's been that close to it.
Okay, the first question that we have here is by a listener by the name of Jackie. She wants to know, Rob, where do you think she is?
I don't know. There's a lot of plausible theories. I don't know. I really don't know. Like I say, we've looked into several avenues. Certainly the river has been looked at, certain individuals' houses. There was even a theory that, because Drew Thornton was a pilot, and that he took her out and either, she died or he threw her out of the plane for knowledge that she had about their drug running. There's also even a theory that there was an accidental overdose. That it wasn't this sexy murder cover-up. It was she overdosed and people panicked and got rid of her body. So as much as it's frustrating, you can probably hear it in my voice. After the decades, close to 40 years, like, people cared about this case. They looked into it. Every detective picked it up. And I did as well. I don't know. We're not stopping. Like I mentioned, there's at minimum one more thing I need to do to follow up on that may lead to additional information. But honestly, I can't tell you which theory I believe in because they're all plausible.
I think one impression I had walking away from it years ago was, and I think it's true with a lot of cases, that as you expand your theory base and you go wider and wider, that there's a point where I think you have to get cautious because we start to romanticize certain elements. And I saw that in some of the investigations I worked, because you have to widen those, but it gets dangerous because the less, in my opinion, the less centric you are, the more risky that is.
Yeah, it's you certainly don't want to put blinders on, but you do have to filter through theories that, God, that sounds amazing. What if they did do that? You have to look at the probability of it, and you have to investigate those, but you can't spend too much time on them. But you're absolutely right. And the longer a case stays open, the more theories are going to get thrown at investigators, and we have to follow up on those. So it's just been so frustrating, and I can't even imagine what that family has gone through. I have so much respect for Doug and Brad and how they've handled themselves. And, even I've spoken with them. They've been frustrated at times with the Lexington Police Department as well. They should have. But, I just tried to be as candid with them as I possibly could. And, I'm retired, but I'm not giving up. I've still got some irons in the fire. And like I say, Brad, I talked to him not too long ago. He provided some information, that we're going to follow up on. It's just, as long as information comes in, it'll be work. You can never promise results, but you can promise your work.
Yeah, I can validate and attest to that it is not sitting. Because in the time I was there, new things would come in, and it's never sat. To the point where it kind of has its own conscience in the police department, to where when we find things in different places, there's I'm going to say an immediate reflection. Right before I left, we found some remains in a car in the Kentucky River. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah.
And I remember that the age of the car was from back in the 70s, and from what I understand, through the coroner's office, they've eliminated that as a possibility. But when it happened, I guess if people could understand how much of the front conscience this is for everybody, because the fire department and some of these people didn't work there. I didn't work there in the 70s, but whenever something like that happens, there's an immediate reference to Melanie's case. And I don't know if that comforts the family much, or because I think the public doubts that sometimes, but man, it's on the tip of everybody's frontal lobe.
Oh, anytime we find remains, I'll get a call. Are you going to ship those to the lab DNA to see if it's Melanie Flynn? It's like, we're going to try to get DNA, and what we do is submit it to NamUs, which is a database down in North Texas State University.
It is, yeah.
That has DNA results or matches from family members for missing persons. So if we find remains, we can enter it into NamUs, and hopefully it matches up closely to a relative of that missing person. And so that's how we identify them.
Well, thanks, Jackie, for sending that question, because it's a good question. It's not simple at all, and it unfortunately doesn't have an answer, but I think we're all hoping one day we do find that out.
For the Flynn's sake, absolutely.
Amen.
Before I pose the next question, why don't you tell our listeners, how old was Melanie when she went missing?
Oh, you've put me on the spot. Late 20s.
All right. Well, Chris asked the question, even with a lack of evidence, what has been the most credible tip thus far?
Kind of goes back to what I was saying before. I think we've had a lot of plausible tips. The fact that we haven't found her, I can't put any more weight in one than the other. We've walked through a couple that certainly could be true. We just don't know that. So I don't know which tip will be the most valuable.
And again, that last one at the river, that one,
I had high hopes.
Yeah, because of the way that one rolled in, and then the amount of effort that got pushed into that. So but I love that question that Chris asked. That's what I think I love about our listeners. That's a very intuitive, insightful question about comparing that.
Yeah, and what you look for is a tip that has several other independent tips that match that. When you're getting information from different sources that match up, you think you're onto something. You know, when you get one tip and it's a sole tip, you're going to look into it, but this is just one person who knows, you know, how valuable it is or whatnot. But when you get 3 or 4 tips from different sources stating the same thing, you know, we're pretty optimistic that it's accurate information.
Yeah. And to go back to that again, too, one more thing is there's a big difference between a tip and a theory.
Absolutely.
And again, the file is full of theories, and some of them are well-intended, I've got no doubt. And we'll move to that conversation in a minute about what people can do to help in these cases. But that's an important thing, is there's a huge dip between having a theory and an actual tip. So, yeah, what's the next question, Wendy? That was good.
The next question is by Sandra. It's another great one. My question is, how did someone admit to knowing where her remains were, yet after exhausting searching with ground-penetrating equipment borrowed from University of Kentucky, using equipment to tear up concrete, ground, etc., how was nothing found, and were her remains moved?
The fact that they could have been removed is a possibility. I doubt it. Let's just say the theory that she was buried down near the river. Probably do that in the middle of the night. It'd be really difficult to go back and spend hours digging up. And where are you going to put them? It's pretty much taken care of. I doubt somebody would run the risk of being discovered, you know, digging down by the river. They had to that night if that's what happened. They buried her. They were crunched on time, had to wait till night and buried her and did the best they could. I seriously doubt they would come back. And as far as the, you know, the equipment, the ground penetrating radar, we learned that there were 2 significant floods after Melanie went missing. Talked to several residents who were around at the time. So much stuff was moved. Erosion taking place over 40 years. So the information actually could have been correct, and the remains were just washed away in this flood. Now, Dave, you know, the river typically gives up its people. I would think if the river took it away, that somewhere a bone would land on, you know, a bank or something like that, but you just never know.
And we're talking 40 years.
Yeah.
Depending upon the conditions and everything, what little remains would be there? And I'm not Dr. Emily Craig, but from experience, I'm going to tell you they would have to be the larger bones would be the only thing left, femurs and things like that.
Skull. Yes.
Exactly. And if it did wash up on a beach, that could, you know, if you get on the Kentucky River for the miles that it goes, and would it be noticed? But it does change shape. Water finds its own, and that river recarves itself. Just about a year ago in Kentucky, there was a riverbank, a small riverbank that exposed some remains, and that one generated interest in the Crystal Rogers investigation because it was in that area. I don't think it connected to that. But again, there's a body of water that rises and erodes, and all of a sudden exposes a grave. And we're launched on that. So yeah, and again, Sandra, that's a fantastic question that she asked about all the king's horses and all the king's men, and that you can do that. But you've got these other things in nature and time that are fighting against you too.
Yeah. And it was, before we go on, a big shout out to the Kentucky State Police. They were right there with us, digging and sweating. R.J. Corman provided a lot of equipment to us free of charge. So, yeah, they were right there with us the entire way. And it got frustrating towards the end because this witness that I talked to in California gave us an area to search. And when do you quit? Could you be 5 feet away? Could you be 2 feet away and you quit? You know, it was so hard to give up because you're thinking, it's like, well, you know, that kind of matches with what he was saying. And we were already down there a month, 2 months. And it's like, okay, guys, we're 4 acres in to this search. How are we just going to kind of keep going till Harrodsburg? You know, so it was really tough to finally call it quits because, you know, you'd hate to find out 10 years later that you were 5 feet away.
Oh, Lord.
So that was a tough call to pull the plug on that.
Well, Sandra, thank you for the fantastic question.
The next question is equally as good, one that I've heard similar stories over the years, not quite exact, but Peggy stated, I lived in Richmond at that time, and was married at 20 years old. I worked at a gift shop inside Rupp Arena. I knew nothing about this. At that time, there was nothing but gravel lots across from Rupp Arena to park my car in. It was a huge lot, and I was kind of scared to walk in it. It now has a hotel in it and probably several other things. With property developing like that, a person could have been hidden underneath any one of those new buildings at that time, and no one would have been the wiser. Lexington was a very scary place as I remember it.
Not saying that couldn't be a possibility, but we really never had any information that that was the case. Was it Jimmy Hoffa supposedly buried underneath Giant Stadium in New York? Yeah. It could be true, but are you going to tear down Giant Stadium? Are we going to tear down the Hyatt? I'm not saying her theory is untrue. We just don't have any actual leads or information to say that that's true. But again, I look at the plausibility. You're talking about a high traffic area that you would go to, even in the middle of the night. They have security guards, and construction sites walking around. I just don't know how plausible that would be to, I just think there's easier avenues to get rid of a body as opposed to driving to downtown Lexington, roughly Broadway and Vine, and getting rid of a body.
You make a good distinguishment between plausibility and possibility, just like tips and things and theories. That's a rumor that had been going around for some time too, is that she might be under the foundation somewhere. And of all the, Pete, hundreds of rumors and theories that are in that case, it makes it difficult. But I love the way Peggy brought in that personal recognition of where she was in her life. And I think a lot of people remember it that way, like where I was and what I was doing. So do we have any more questions?
We do. We have two more, actually. One of them, the next question, is by our friends at the Lexington Podcast.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They want to know, Rob, the Herald Leader reported about 2 years ago that, quote, a man on his deathbed, end quote, led investigators in a different location than originally thought. Who was the man and what did he say? Also, how extensively was the Kentucky River/rock quarry searched? Any and all connections to the Bluegrass Conspiracy? ?
Well, I won't mention the individual's name. He asked me not to unless this came to an arrest and he recognized that he'd have to be a witness. So I'm going to honor his request. And I don't know if we're talking about the same person. I assume we are, but he was certainly not on his deathbed. He was certainly older, but I wouldn't consider him on his deathbed. So first of all, I don't know if we're talking about the same person. And yeah, the connections to the Bluegrass Conspiracy, the Lexington police detectives having some potential involvement have been investigated. Again, that's a theory that could be true. We just don't have the evidence to prove that it is or was at the time.
I wonder if they were, and it came from the Herald Leader, and I'm pretty sure that's Erica and Jonathan. They're going to be accurate on quoting something. I wonder if they confused that with Bill Canan, because didn't Bill have cancer at some point?
He passed, I want to say, a year ago, so that could be who they're talking about, but he certainly did not provide any new information in the Melanie Flynn case.
Gotcha. Good question, though. And they are, I just recommend it. The Lexington Podcast did an excellent expose on the Bluegrass Conspiracy that I'd recommend people listening to.
It seems like they have really good information.
Oh, they do. And they're thoughtful. I just can't say enough good about them. They're thoughtful and they're sincere and accurate.
Yeah, I wish I had better answers for their questions. It was a good question.
Oh, and we'll probably arrange a meeting one day.
Sounds good.
Because they would love to drill you.
Our last question is by someone by the name of Kat. Kat wants to know, who was the last person to see her?
That escapes me. Chris Schooner would be the person to answer that question, but I believe she was just on her way to see her doctor. So it would have been a friend, her leaving her apartment or work that she talked to, and I believe it was in the middle of the afternoon. So it was just a normal day and was supposed to go to her doctor and never showed up, apparently.
And I think, if I remember correctly, and this is loose, is that there were people who possibly saw her vehicle on Nicholasville Road. And we've got to say possibly because it's pretty loose, but that's what I recall too. She was on her way to a doctor, and that they're...
And I would say that was probably accurate because I think the doctor's office was on Nicholasville Road, so that certainly could be true.
A little bit loose, but it's. I just remember when they were piecing those early parts together.
Yeah, you can't completely disregard it. You just can't verify it.
Well, I want to thank Kat and the rest of the people that sent in questions, and that's why we love our listeners that pay attention. Fantastic questions. They would be welcome inside the Homicide Bay anytime to toss theories around, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think also with, a lot of amateur detectives, as people like to call them, a lot of people nowadays with social media research and Google, et cetera, research things. And you have to wonder how many things, and I certainly watch on documentaries, amateur detectives, if you will, that stumble upon stuff that really crack cases open that maybe eyes didn't catch, or maybe a new set of eyes catch, or inquiring people like me just want to keep digging and digging until they find something. How do you all feel about that?
Well, as an investigator, all that you want in any case is information, accurate information. I don't care where it comes from. But you can get overloaded with inaccurate information, and that will bog an investigation down. Dave, you and I have talked about private investigators or grassroots detectives looking to help out in cases, and I've always welcomed them. Anybody willing to help. Now, I can weed them out pretty quickly of who's sincere and who's a quality investigator, or somebody just looking for their 15 minutes of fame. But I will give them the benefit of the doubt and bring them in to an extent. And I've worked really well with a couple of private investigators, Brian Engel, Al Bournet. Of course, Al was a retired sergeant, spent some time in Homicide, I believe. Yeah, they've assisted me in cases when I've kind of been overloaded and there's non-legal investigations that can be done, and they've helped me out and been a tremendous asset. But yeah, no, I'm not opposed to anybody trying to help an investigation, as long as they do it in the right way and are respectful and recognize that it may not seem fair, but it is a one-way street. They can give us what I've told them is like, I hope you understand we have to protect the integrity of the case. I'm not going to be able to talk to you about everything involved in the case, but you're going to have to tell me everything you've done. That may not sound fair, but that's the way it has to be. And the good ones understand that completely, and they still want to help. So that's a good first impression when they're willing to do that and play by those rules. Yeah, I certainly welcome any and all help and information.
And I'm a big believer in it too. Sometimes we call that crowdsourcing, and I don't have an aversion to it. I think that one thing that you said that I like is I'm to the point where I don't even like it when they are identified either by themselves or other people as amateur detectives. I use the word grassroots. Yeah. I thought about the other day because Wendy's always got some true crime thing on. That's the only thing that the TV, they are burned in the images of the TV in the house. There's nothing else that gets played. And I watched, and the thing is that they can be very resourceful and they have time. Yes. And I think that's where, when I look at, this has legs, as we would say, is that first you hit it. What is your motivation? And a lot of these people that I've seen that really do good with this, that I see on TV, they didn't do it to get on TV. They have an internal passion. Something calls on them and speaks. And the ability to take and dig and dig and dig is so critical, because that's actually what kills you when you're actually doing this for a living. Right. It's the lack of time. We talked about that. So I don't even like calling them amateurs. I think they need to. I think they've got to find a better name for themselves, because I think they can have a lot of value.
Because there are some good ones out there. I come across people all the time in everyday life. I get into a conversation with them, and we'll be talking about cases, and they'll come up, well, did you do this in this situation? And we just go down. It's like, you'd be a really good investigator.
Amen.
But, yeah. And he was a high school teacher. But I think it's the type of person, the type of mind that you have, a certain skill set or a curiosity that makes a good investigator. You don't have to go to a police academy to get that.
No.
Now there's a benefit as far as the legal aspects of it, but, there's some smart people out there that I think would be very good investigators.
Do you have a fundraiser coming up? Putting together an event and need something to help market it? With the holidays approaching, do you need gift ideas for your company or organization? Hero Industries has you covered. Hero is known for their cute and adorable K9 Hero plushies and their stunning challenge coins, but that's not all they have to offer. Hero also offers custom bottle openers, lapel pins, cigar cutters, tactical teddy bears, and custom badges. Any logo, any badge, any size, any shape. You pick how you want it. Just send Hero your logo and how you want it to look, and Hero makes it happen. Hero's excellent customer service makes it easy for you to design your item and offers a variety of accessories to pair with your order. Hero Industries has been working with law enforcement, government agencies, and canine handlers throughout the U.S. since 2000 by providing top-notch service with amazing details and one-of-a-kind products. Check out Hero Industries on Instagram at hero_industries_inc or cruise their website at www.hero-industries.com.
Well, when we're talking about this kind of thing where we've got people, grassroots people, amateur detectives, or people that are just helping and everything, I guess one thing to talk about is maybe the legal ramifications about where things start and stop and what it takes to get things introduced into a case and survive court. And one thing that brings this up is that at the time we're recording this, the big hot case right now is Gabby Petito. And there's a huge, huge motion by people to get involved in this at varying degrees. And I'm watching it, and most of it I'm thinking, okay, we could turn some help with this and everything. But then there's a part of me that the worry wart is like, could people be crossing boundaries in areas that may not be beneficial to the case? So what in your opinion, if somebody was gonna work on a case, which is great to crowdsource it, what are some things as an investigator, Rob, that you would look at as far as when they brought you the information and when they brought you the information that would probably make it play out best?
Well, let me go back to what I was saying where I talked to several people that have just normal jobs, a teacher, a banker, whatever, that would make really good investigators. But they don't have to go through an academy to be a good investigator, but you have to go through that academy to learn legal issues like search and seizure, crossing boundaries to go on a property. So even the best intended grassroots investigators could knowingly come across evidence, taint it accidentally, or go onto a property that's not theirs and they're actually committing criminal trespass. So even with the good intentions, you could potentially mess up a case. So I'm all for anybody that is willing to help me in a case, but I have to talk to them. It's like, you have to be very cautious. If you get information, give it to me and then we'll work it. We'll go from there. Don't ever get information and go take that next step without me. It's not that I'm micromanaging. There are just certain things legally I know that they don't. And I don't want someone to find a piece of evidence that's very valuable and all of a sudden it's determined inadmissible on down the road and it gets lost in a suppression hearing. So even though they're very well intended, they just don't know a lot of legal steps that you have to take to secure that evidence.
And that's a good point. And I think that's where my worry comes in for some people is I would never want to see somebody who's so well intended get in a jam. And, because a lot of people make assumptions, like you said, on stepping on other people's property or going into someone's house. For you and I, that would be a constitutional violation,
right? Fourth
Amendment, and we would have the evidence thrown out, right? And we may not even have a job, depending upon how mad the boss has got, which is reasonable. For them, that's usually called criminal trespassing or burglary.
Right. And talk about the good intentions. I recently watched that Richard Jewell movie. The guy had the best intentions in the world, and it turned on him real quick. So
what a great example.
Yeah, I'd hate to have somebody, especially with this Petito case, somebody with the best intentions. It's so high profile that they could discover something and then wind up messing up the actual investigation. It'd be awful for them.
It would, and because their heart is not in that. They don't want to make that. I like too that you talked about bringing the information too, and I'd guess we could agree quickly.
Yes, absolutely. As soon as you find it, and like I said, I've mentioned a couple of investigators that I've worked with in the private sector. And they know exactly what to do. Hey, I found this out. Let me know if you want to do something else with it, and I'll evaluate it. It's like, okay, let's push this a little forward. It's got some legs, and then we'll discuss what needs to be done. But yeah, they have to understand that they're in constant communication with the police department because the last thing we want is a case wrecked.
Exactly. I think that's good advice. I think it's what people need to hear. And again, with the Gabby case is, for example, and some of the people, I'm just going to be candid, I don't know if they're really well intended or not, if they're just seeking 15 minutes of fame. But when you're talking about poking and prodding around connecting with people to me would be a problem in the wrong time too, because for example, you can run a witness underground very quickly. One of the things I see in social media with Gabby's case is, and I guess this is where we need to teach civics classes in school again, is that people talking about, for example, with the person of interest or suspect.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you, it doesn't look good for this guy. There's no way. But you'll have people say, well, it's time to bring the parents in and make them talk. And I'm like, well, there's that pesky thing called the Constitution. And even when they catch this guy, and I don't know his name, I really don't care to say his name on here. Even when they catch him, he can just invoke and it
Absolutely.
stops. So it's funny how I think people put that together. And I worry that if people divulge too much, if they lean in too much, that's why it's important to connect with somebody and to build a rapport.
Yeah.
That's got to happen. Communication skills are a big deal.
Absolutely. And with the, you mentioned giving witnesses and family members time to breathe. We talked about that, I think, last time with Chris. Did you all keep in contact? When did you go talk to the family? It's like, well, we weren't going to bother on that day. They were planning a funeral. We have other things we can do. We don't want to, because we have to have their cooperation. You don't want to bug them in a horrible time in their life to where it's like, I've already told you everything I know. Just please leave us alone. Give us our time to grieve. And I understand that, but there's a tact that goes with it. So it's very light treading. And then you get all these other people that want to help out. And you may contact the family one day, but you have no idea if these other individuals, they're getting on social media or bombarding them. It's like, you need to bring your son in and all this stuff. And you're going to shut them down. And you brought it up exactly right. It's like, I believe more than likely, and I'm never going to Monday morning quarterback an investigation. I've had it done to me and I don't like it. Yes, I would agree with everything I've heard on the media, which doesn't mean it's true, that more than likely this guy had something to do with her death. But you brought it up brilliantly. If he hadn't even run away or gone to hide, he could have just said at his home, it's like, I'm not going to make a statement with you without my attorney, and my attorney's recommending that I don't speak with you all. Where do you go?
And you're done for that moment. And that's the other thing too, is that in all of this is that what if you're wrong? Sure. And again, we could get into a whole big thing in society now about this cancel culture and calling people out in public and everything. But what if people are wrong with the parents and whatever? But I did see some good things that there's a few insightful people that I saw a little bit of a debate today about with the parents about parents of criminal suspects.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they are, but
right.
But there are certain dynamics that happen in families that you and I and somebody that's been around it, even though we're not crazy about it, we'd look at it and say, I recognize that.
Yes.
And it's a possibility.
Yeah. But I mean, you have to tread lightly with it. And again, those are tough cases. My heart goes out to those investigators that are running that, because they feel the weight. The entire nation, I'm using quotes, knows who killed Gabby. But it's such a different story than knowing and proving.
And that's what I think they're hearing all the time. And then again, you've got some people, well-intended or not, that could be running the wrong interference out there.
Yeah, and sometimes it really bogs it down if you're providing information, but it's really misinformation.
There we go.
If you're talking about, they'll relay information like, well, I heard this from this person I talked to, and then you spend time, it's like, okay, you didn't hear that from them. They heard it from someone, so it's actual hearsay. And by the time you track it down, it got started 8 people ago, and it's not even close to accurate what you told me. So you get that telephone game going on all the time where I've got this information, I know this. How do you know it? Well, I talked to Mr. Taylor. You talk to Mr. Taylor. No, I heard it from Mr. Smith. And you go down that rabbit hole, and it winds up, the information is just not valuable whatsoever.
And there's a lot of time wasted.
Wasted, yes.
Yeah. And coming back to Melanie Flynn, I think that there's been so many theories, again, shot forward that have to be looked at.
Absolutely.
And I think that makes it very difficult. And hopefully with that. So I guess summing it up is that definitely everybody would want help with any of these cases. I know I wouldn't turn it away.
No, if that phone rings, I'm going to answer it. I'm going to listen to it. I'm going to write down the information. I'm going to check it out. And hopefully it's, the last piece of the puzzle that I needed.
Yeah. Because, we take information from all walks of society.
Absolutely. We have anonymous tip lines. You can call the Bureau of Investigations, 258-3700. There will be a detective there ready to listen to you.
Amen.
Well, and I think also you don't know when that one tip or that one amateur detective may have something that blows the case apart. So you hate to not take heed to every one of them because it may be that one piece you've been missing.
Yeah, it's you're doing a great disservice to the investigation if you're the investigator and refuse to talk to somebody that says they have information. And you know what? I've seen it play out to where this isn't the most credible person that's calling in, but they've got a piece of the story that I didn't have before, but it's corroborated by other pieces of the puzzle. So this person may not be the most trustworthy witness or caller, but they provided valuable information. And the public doesn't know everything we know, so they may assume it's like, oh, I'm sure they know about this person. Please don't assume that.
That's where I was going to go next. Well, how can people help? So we've talked about the people that, and again, I think it's just great that people are getting involved in investigations, and as long as they understand some guidelines to protect them and protect the case and protect the family. But what are some people, like, for example, Melanie Flynn, what do you think we need to hear on that?
Oh, I don't know. Anybody with information, call. More than likely, if they call in the police department today with information, those detectives would take the information, probably call me or Chris and say, hey, have you all heard about this information? We either say, yeah, we looked into it. It wound up being a dead end. Please feel free to look into it yourself, because I'm not perfect. Maybe, your eyes see it differently. Or we can say, no, we've never had that call. You need to run with it. So, yeah, just because it happened in the late 70s, if we get information, I guarantee you in this day and age, the Lexington Police Department will follow up on that information.
And with any case, again,
absolutely.
Nothing's too small. Nothing's insignificant. It's something that somebody thinks is inconsequential can actually, like you said, piece something together in that puzzle to make it run a lot faster. So nothing's small. And yeah. I do know that I think this stands true and will be timeless, that there are very few murder cases where only one person knows. And I mean, everywhere. And because at some point they've either had help, they've confided in somebody. We were talking offline about, for example, how many cases that we might have cleared with that old saying, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Yeah.
Where they've told somebody or they've confided, or somebody that they knew took an article from them one night, like a gun, and didn't get an explanation. I mean, hell, I've interviewed people that helped move bodies rolled up in carpets, and they were like, I knew it was heavy, but I didn't think. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll hold a judgment in the back of my mind as to whether you're telling me the truth.
Right.
But there's so many ancillary pieces that people are walking around with. And we've all seen cases that finally close and go because maybe something like a conscience gets to them, or maybe they get angry at somebody. But the idea that there's a perfect crime is ridiculous.
You can sit around, like we've worked years and years and years around murders, and you and I could sit around and probably plan the perfect murder because we dealt with these investigations. But if you and I set out to kill someone and get away with it, with all our experience, I bet we'd mess up 25 times.
Amen.
There's always a thing you don't think about. So I hate to say any murder is unsolvable, but again, we go back to the community. There is always somebody out there that knows about every unsolved murder. All they need to do is pick up the phone.
Right. There's always an integral piece that's not being discussed.
Yeah, Detective Franz Wolf, who was with the unit for a long time, he's still in the department. He's in forensic services now. When he was brand new to the unit, he had, I think his first murder was a real stinker. Guy shot and set on fire. And he worked it as hard as he could. And he came to me as I was a senior detective. He's like, what else do I need to do on this? And I read through the case file and was like, put it on the shelf. Buddy, you've done everything that I can think of. Sometimes you just have to sit and the phone will ring, and that will give you the thread that you can pull the entire sweater apart with. Sure enough, 6 months later, a phone call came in and he's had it solved within 5 hours of that phone call. Yeah. And it's all due to community cooperation.
And building relationships with people.
Sure. Yeah. It's just treating people with respect in every encounter that you make with them. And that's, I mentioned that in my years on patrol. I got a lot of confidential informants when I was on the streets. And it just came from treating people with respect and helping them out when I could. It's not charging them with a drug charge and hanging that over their head. That'll work for one case, but once they've worked that off, they're done with you. So it really is about creating relationships in the community.
That'd be a neat show to get a bunch of people together to talk about those wins.
Yeah.
Because I remember real quick, something similar to that is I got out with a woman one time that in downtown Lexington, and she was working. She was a street prostitute, and met her, introduced myself, just offered that, if you could ever help me and everything. And I got the typical salutation that started with F and ended with you. And, but amazingly enough, it was within maybe about 6 months during a brutal murder I got a phone call from her one night on my pager back when we had pagers, and she led me right to one of the suspects.
Yeah. And I think it's different too with these people may have knowledge about drug cases or whatnot. And that's not necessarily worth it to them because they do still have to live in the community. But a lot of the informants that I've had are decent people, and these murders shock the conscience, and they can't let that go. So there's a couple that after a while, they didn't even ask for any money. And it's like, this is just wrong. This kid was a good kid. He shouldn't have been gunned down. I'm hearing this. It turns out to be true. And
we find them in walks of life that a lot of people won't appreciate.
Absolutely.
I think that was just an amazing experience in and of itself. Well, Wendy, do you have anything else of Rob on this cold case investigation stuff that you'd like to ask?
No, I just, I guess, and I mean, Rob, who am I to tell you how to do your job? You've been doing it for so many years and you do it exceptionally. I think from somebody that sits and watches this a lot on TV, a lot, do take heed to what people say when they call in. It may, like you already know, it may just be that one small tip or maybe something that you maybe just didn't think of, getting so busy in your day-to-day tasks or this case, and then now this case is added on. And it may just be that one thing that you think, you know what, I never thought of that.
Yeah. No, but like I stated, please don't assume that the information that you have is not valuable. We'll make that determination. And I have people call in all the time. It's like, hey, I just want to let you know I heard this. And it's like, we've had several other calls, but seriously, thank you very much for the concern and the time that you took to call in and help out the police department. So, I always try to, even if the information's not valuable, I always try to go out of my way to thank them for their time and their concern. If I could, since I retired, the budget's kind of tough on the Lexington Police Department right now, and my spot may not be filled. I think it's an important part. Please don't bother Chief Weathers because he's a great man and a busy man. But if you all think that the cold case unit is very necessary, please contact your councilman.
Good idea.
Because I understand times are tough, but I hated walking away because there's a couple that I know I could have put down with another 6 months or a year. And I talk to friends. It's like, it's going to be tough to retire. And that's why, because it's tough to let that go, knowing that there's somebody out there that could get away with murder if I retire, knowing that it's not going to be filled. So, I think it's an important unit, and it's not necessarily to solve them, but to the victims' families, that someone is still looking, someone still cares. So I think it's an important unit, and hopefully it gets filled. But if you find out it's not, please contact your councilman.
Yeah, and on a local level, that's a good idea. I'll tell people that I enjoyed working with the council members when I was there. We've got great government representation in town, and they're extremely receptive. I'll tell you this, in Lexington, if you've never reached out and had a discussion with one of your representatives in the council, you need to start doing that, because you'll find them that they're very receptive and talented, and they really care about the community. Taking that outside of Lexington, that's the same, that could go across the country, is that we know that these victims' surviving family members and friends need that resolution, that need things to move forward. So emphasizing that, even in tough times, about the importance of that is a big deal.
Yeah, there's good people that could certainly step into my shoes and continue it on and make some arrest and, give the family some peace of mind.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I want to thank the people that took the time to message us on the Melanie Flynn case. And,
thank you. Great questions.
Oh, they were amazing. And when they would come in, I was like, wow, that's good stuff. That they're really thinking, they're insightful. And I think that sums up our listener base, actually, is that people are looking for more of a deeper conversation on these matters, and they represented it well. And And thank you, Rob, for taking the time to come talk. And congratulations again on your retirement.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy coming to talk to you guys.
Yes, thank you so much.
We'll do much more. And then finally, too, I think that we just need to maybe say a little bit about hoping that eventually Melanie Flynn's case comes to rest and that the family gets that resolution and the community gets it, because everybody, this town has tracked that case forever, and hopefully we get to a point where we put that away.
Yeah, nothing would make me happier than give that family some answers and some peace.
And Gabby Petito, we talked a little bit about that, and I didn't, we're not going to do any shows on guessing what happened to her or anything like that. That's being covered in other places, but it was a good segue into people assisting police, especially people that are, I think, doing valuable investigative work on the side with the time they have. So
yeah, as long as the relationship is established with the police department, then it can be very effective.
Amen. Well, good deal. Well, thank you again, Rob.
Thank you, Rob.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about the presenters, and much, much more. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed captioned for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast from. Make sure to subscribe to the Murder Police podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.